Hola, Howard. ¿Cómo está?
No, pues ahí más o menos cómo van las cosas.
Bien, bien.
Bien,
Make you a co-host so then you can turn on your camera.
ok. Debe haber otra forma de, en vez de hacerme cojos, pero no sé. Bueno, cómo funciona, pues
Sí, just having to put you in.
ya, está bien.
Okay. Vamos a esperar que entren los demás.
Sí, muy bien.
Hola, Tania.
Hola, ¿qué tal?
Ya, Tania.
¿Me escuchan?
Sí.
Sí.
Clases es en inglés o en español. Si prefieren ponerlo en español, estará bien. Nosotros nos encargamos de traducirlo. Entonces, por favor, todos eligen un canal. Sería en donde hay el botón de interpretación. Sería abajo de su pantalla, usualmente a su mano derecha. Si hagan clic allí, pueden elegir el canal preferido. Sería en inglés o sería en español. Again, if you're just joining in, this is a multilingual space, so please make sure you can see the interpretation button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You click on it and you choose English if you so choose, or you can choose Spanish. And then we have the rest of the buttons, the Q&A, you're raising your hand, and your chat, as you can see there, if you have any questions or difficulties. Tal vez si no han elegido un canal, por favor eligen un canal en el globito, si hagan clic en el globito, van a poder ver ahí. Y también son los otros botones para preguntas y respuestas, para levantar la mano, y el botón de la ventana de chat. Entonces, por favor, si pueden oír bien en el canal de español, si pueden marcar que sí. If you all can hear well, if you could please write yes in the chat box, that would be great. We just want to make sure we can hear everybody. And everybody can hear us more than anything. It looks like everybody can hear us and everybody is muted. If you could just keep typing yes so we can make sure everybody's audio is working. Si acaso están recién llegando, por favor eligen el canal que necesitan en el botón de interpretación que sería abajo de su pantalla. Please be sure you choose a language in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You'll see the interpretation button. Please click there and choose a channel, English or Spanish. Please be sure you choose English if that's what you need. And with that, I think we're getting ready. Yes, Karen is asking if this is the time and effort Zoom meeting. Yes, it is. Okay. And with that, I think everybody's set up. We'll go ahead and turn it over to Mark. Mark, you're muted. There we go.
Okay, Good afternoon. This is Mark Hernandez. We're doing the time and effort reporting, and also we'll talk about personnel files for this webinar. One of the questions, or what we'd like to do, is if you have questions, please type them in the chat box. We like to have that information so that we'll pull together an FAQ document and use all the information from those questions to put into the document, and hopefully within 2 weeks, send that out to everyone with the question and the answer at that point. We'll also have time at the end of this webinar to go ahead and have questions at that time. But if you go ahead and type in a question on the chat, Finian will look at that and he will direct me if I have time to go ahead and answer that question. If I feel like I need a little bit more to finish a special project or slide in that regard, then I'll just wait and then I'll answer it after the fact. Or I'll just say we'll wait till the end and then pull the rest of the questions on an FAQ. One other thing that I'd like for people that actually have an electronic timekeeping system, if you could put into your chat whether you do have that, well, whether you have that and what type of software that you're using. I'd like to, at the end of this webinar, also open it up for a little bit of discussion after the question and answer section to just kind of go around and discuss each person that has an electronic timekeeping system, the value of it, or the issues or hiccups that you've had before. I think this will help everyone. The time and effort currently right now that we're using over here will be for the webinar will be with Excel as the document to do. So as we go now, I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Hold on, Mark. I just wanted to make the announcements one more time as some folks
Okay.
are joining in. For folks that are just joining in, this is a multilingual space. If you would look on your screen at the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see an interpretation globe. Please click on the interpretation globe and choose your channel, whether it's English or Spanish. If you are joining from a tablet, the tablet will likely have 3 buttons that say more. You can go ahead and click that, and then you'll see the interpretation option, and then click the channel that you prefer. Please make sure you choose the channel. If you're monolingual English or you prefer to hear in English, please go ahead and click that channel. Si acaso están recién llegados a nuestra reunión, por favor, les queríamos avisar que este es un espacio multilingüe. Entonces, si ven abajo de su pantalla, a su mano derecha, hay un globito que dice interpretación. Entonces, si por favor pueden hacer clic allí y eligen el canal preferido, sería en inglés o en español, pero por favor eligen un canal. Tal vez si se están uniendo con nosotros por medio de una tableta, quizás no ven un globito, sino que tienen un área quizás abajo a su mano derecha o arriba de su pantalla, su mano derecha, es un área que dice More y tiene 3 puntitos. Entonces, si hagan clic ahí, pueden ver también la opción de interpretación. Y luego de ahí pueden escoger el canal preferido, sería en inglés o en español. También si hay preguntas, por favor, los pueden poner en la ventana de chat o en donde dice Q&A. No le hace si las preguntas están en español, nosotros nos encargamos de interpretar o de traducir así como es necesario. So again, please go ahead and choose your language, whether it's English or Spanish. The bottom right hand with the interpretation sign, please check English or Spanish. And if you're having any difficulties or anything's coming up, please let us know in the chat.
Denise,
Yes.
someone said that you are cutting in and out.
I'm not sure. Maybe it's the internet on her end. I don't see anybody else saying that. Are they able to hear? Were they able to hear Mark? Okay.
Let me find out.
Looks like most folks can because they're answering the question about the electronic timekeeping.
Just only one person.
Okay, so I think we should be good.
Okay.
Sounds good. Okay,
Okay. Sorry.
I changed devices to hear better. Okay, and Serena, is that working for you?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so back over to Mark.
Okay. I'm going to put the video off on me so I can set up my laptop the right way. So here we go. Great. So again, we're going to be talking about the time and effort reporting. This is based on just not having an electronic system. So as we talk about it, we do have a sample of an Excel spreadsheet that could be used either by activity or fund source. As we go there, we'll talk about that. The acronyms for this presentation, the Code of Federal Regulation is the section for the guidance for grants now. It has changed from the OMB circulars now to the Tcfr Part 200. And this will be where we'll get all of our citations for this webinar. We'll talk about the I-9 and E-Verify later on in the personnel files section. We'll also talk about FSLA and the FSR throughout this webinar. We also will be talking about full-time equivalents. That would be a position that may be split funded. So the full-time equivalents might be 50% FTE for one grant and maybe 50% on another grant or unrestricted. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about FTEs. Along the way, we'll also have the discussion on general ledgers. The citation actually has IHE, and that's for the institutions of higher education. They have some differences that are in there. So I just want y'all to know as you look at the citation, if it has that, you do not need to worry about it for nonprofits or governmental entities. If you're in an audit or a monitoring, you may have an auditor do the short term of asking for your PAR. That's a personal activity report, which could be both the timesheet and any other activity report that you would have. And then finally, we have the policies and procedures, which the new guidance is now pushing more towards that than the timesheet itself. So what we're going to talk about, I thought it'd be easier first to talk about what an auditor looks for in the timesheet and how we can mitigate any findings at that time. When the auditor looks for that information, they're going to actually look at the timesheet. Does it comply within the CFR Part 200.430 compensation? That's where compensation and timesheets and all kinds of information are gathered for this, for personnel. Within the 4.30, we'll actually talk about the standards of documentation. Standards of documentation are where you get the information on how to provide your policies and procedures, and policies and procedures are considered the best source for internal control. We'll also later talk about payroll testing after we get through with all the citations so that you can see what an auditor looks for when they start to take your time and effort report, your general ledger and everything to do their payroll testing at that point. And then finally, we'll be talking about personnel files. That's another part that is in the personnel part of what auditors look for. So we'll go through kind of an example of that. So here's an example of what an auditor would put together. They would either use a spreadsheet or some sort of database. but these are the main components in what they do when they review. So the first one naturally would be, does it meet the circular, in the sense that, does it meet 2 CFR Part 200? And as you can see in this sample, that the answer was no and no. And the reason why was that the timesheet did not report 100% of the person's time. So that will be talked about later as we go along. They'll look to see that the timesheet and your general ledgers and everything fit with the salary that's charged. They will also look at the time and effort reporting after the fact. Now, with the new guidance, after the fact is not talked about in that area and can be kind of quite open. The reason that an auditor would look at the time and effort after the fact is if they're looking at your timesheet and you've signed the timesheet a week before the month is over, that would represent to them that you haven't truly finished your timesheet. So that is part of it, even though it's not specific into the new rules. It used to be in A122, which was for the nonprofits. They'll also look at that to see that the timesheet matches the correct month and that the timesheet is signed by personnel and your supervisor. Now, in this situation, we have it as the program manager had a no in there, and then the description would be that the supervisor didn't sign the program manager's timesheet. The auditor keeps that information so that they'll have the information to go ahead and write the report. And as they go through the different sections of their report, they will take that and then make that citation.
Mark.
Yes.
Mark, can I interrupt? Kerry, Taylor, and Lemonade, they're not seeing the PowerPoint.
Oh. Does anybody else see the PowerPoint? Is it?
Others are seeing it except 2 people. Okay.
They may need to close out and then come back in.
Okay.
And see if that works, because if everybody else is seeing it, there must be a glitch on their side.
Okay.
Thank you. Now the citation in the Tcfr, first of all, the Tcfr Part 200 is a pretty voluminous documentation. It has close to 400 to almost 500 pages of documentation that is used for grants at this point. So when you're looking to see what you need to do for your time and effort and also for your compensation, you would go to 200 Part 430, which is stated as compensation. Now, we will be talking about compensation in this area when it goes down further. Actually, compensation will start with A, B, C, D, E, talking about the actual compensation. For this webinar, we're actually going to be talking about section I, which will be the documentation that is needed. But primarily with the new Tcfr, programs can now use either hours or percentages in their timesheets. Most people use hours, and then at the very end, when they total up for the month, they'll calculate the percentage of time so that it can make sure to charge the right billable charge of time and effort at that point. Timesheets should also have 100% of the activities of the employee. So we'll be seeing that in the documentation that comes forth further. Compensation, when you're looking at timesheets, will be all of the person's time, the employee's time. So that could include grant-related or non-grant-related activities. So it represents 100%. And again, in multiple funds where employees have split time, then you just need to distribute your time allocation accordingly. again, in here, there would be the after the fact of accounting that's supported for your charge to your grant. So you would be using the timesheet and then going to the general ledger to make sure that the accurate charges are made. The timesheet will also need to have, because of the 100%, it will also reconcile for any FSLA hours that are needed at the same time. FSLA will be used for when you have non-exempt employees, and if they go past the time of your hourly week, which could be either 36 hours or 40 hours, then overtime would need to be charged at that point. The timesheet should comply with your accounting policies and procedures. And the new part of the compensation is that budget estimates alone do not qualify supporting documentation, but they can be used in transition. So in a temporary situation, you may have 2 months where you can use the budget estimate, but then you'll need to reconcile. The standards of documentation also is now changed to where it relies more on policies and procedures, which gives most programs a little bit more latitude in their process. The policies and procedures, again, is the actual documentation of internal control of the process. So it's kind of a balance between, oh, well, we had to do such and such on specifically for time and effort reporting in timesheets, to where now it can be in the policies and procedures. That is good to a certain degree, but that means most programs will probably need to beef up their policies and procedures just to be able to provide what the normal hours are, whether the exempt employees and non-exempt employees meet the FSLA, different parts of that that you may need to put into your time and effort report. Also that you might have other things in there that would be for whether who signs on the timesheet and the activities that come across. And then finally, your timesheet now becomes really the supporting documentation to the activities that you have, and it's the supporting documentation to your policies and procedures. So an auditor will actually start probably looking at your policies and procedures to see if you have any internal controls for your timekeeping, your time and effort. And then they will follow up by going to the timesheet and actually reviewing that and see if it actually coincides with your policies. So that's an area that if your policies are not strong, you might have a finding in that direction. Now, the standard of documentation is in the 200.430. It's actually under I as the citation note. Within that I citation, there is actually 5 areas of documentation. The first one, which is up here, is the most important one. It talks about, you know, your salary and wages and how you base your recording of the work itself for the work that's performed. That's the most important part. Later, after we get through each of the sections of documentation, we'll actually go into section 1, because that's the one that you truly need to meet in that situation. As you can see, for part 2, it basically states if you meet part 1, then you don't need to do anything else. But there might be a situation where if you don't, then you might need some other supporting documentation to perform and be in compliance. Part 3 we'll get to, but basically that's what part 2 is talking about. Part 3, we're talking about FSLA again. And the reason it's important in the time and effort report is that most organizations have exempt employees and non-exempt employees. Now, non-exempt employees are within the FSLA will record any overtime that it's been used at that by that person. It is typically not an allowable expense, even though the new CFR provides for that to be allowable. In most situations, what the funding agency will do is they say, yes, it's allowable by the circulars, but for this particular grant, we don't allow for overtime. And this is where you would need to make sure on your reconciliation, specifically before the end of the work week or pay period, that you work with your staff to ensure that they don't go over that time unless they get prior approval. If they do get prior approval, then more than likely your organization will need to pay for the overtime in unrestricted funds. Part 4 basically talks about if you're using salaries from employees that are going to be used as match or cost sharing. The key area right here in the middle, you can see the keyword must is in citations and reading regulations. When it says must, it means you have to do that. If it read should, then you have some latitude in that direction. So in this case, if you're using salaries from, let's say, a state grant or unrestricted funds, and you're going to use that for your match, then they must be the same as what your other employees use as time and effort. The last part will be that this section is for entities that are either state, local units of government, or Indian tribes. They get a little bit more flexibility than the rest of us in that situation. Due to the type that they have, they can actually substitute the process as long as they get approval from the funding agency to do something that might be a substitute for the time and effort report in your timesheet. Now, as I said, the section 1 is the most important one. As you can see that if you are in compliance with section 1, then you're fairly much in compliance with the rest of them. The main thing in here is that we talk about your internal control. Internal control requires that it's reasonable assurance. Organizations may get that confused with absolute assurance. Virtually any kind of control that you have will not provide absolute assurance due to the variables that happen in that process. But for grant guidelines, all they're requiring is a reasonable assurance that your timesheet is accurate, it's allowable, and that it's properly allocated. So if you're in a funding system and you're multi-split grants, then it's properly allocated to those grants. And then again, that timesheet should be incorporated into your policies and procedures, which is your official records. The other part is that you're providing, again, reasonable assurance, but in this case, you're using it for 100% of the compensation. And again, the reason for this is that you want to have your timesheet up to 100% of the activities are done, again, for FSLA. And as you can see in here, the institutions of higher education have a little bit more latitude because of their scheduling with classes and other things and grant-related stuff and that a lot of their personnel might be on indirect costs. They're allowed to do a little bit different than just this 100%. Standard 4 in this case is that you are now again talking about integrating your activities for all of your activities that you're doing, both grant and non-grant, and it needs to be included into your entities organizational policies and procedures. Now, in this case, you could have something that has some time and effort, but that you're also using something else as a subsidiary record that actually brings the two things together to make it into an integrated basis. One of these things could be either a time and effort report or a time report, and then you have your effort report, which is your monthly activities. Those would be combined into that kind of thing, that situation. Another subsidiary record could be that in this process, as you're doing time and your time and effort and your compensation, that you might have your payroll report, which is a general ledger, and then a subsidiary ledger that would be for each of the individual grants that you're in, so that it allocates the amount of time and the cost to each grant in that situation. So that's where you might be using a subsidiary record to integrate the system. In this process, you should also make sure that everything in your time and effort report, your timesheet, is established in your accounting policies and procedures. Again, this the Tcfr has really leaned towards policies and procedures in the process. Now, again, you can see that institutions of higher education have some latitude. They actually will direct them to H. H is actually the section in the compensation that deals with institutions of higher education. So you can see in this citation, it actually points them where to go for treatment of incidental work. Number 6 is just reserved at this point. They had that set up so that if there's other things that happen within the Tcfr, which has been changed a couple of times from the initial rollout, which was December 30th of 2014, there have been, I think, 1 or 2 upgrades since that point. And I think they're going through another upgrade that will be for 2021 grant period. So they've left that space set just in case. And then here we're talking about your, on section 6, we're talking about the wages that could be either done by specific activities, or you may have some employees that are on cost objectives. Cost objectives in that situation would be indirect cost. So you would need to kind of set up your process to do that. But this would be the guidance within the part if you have employees that are on an indirect cost with the grant. Section 6 here will actually give a little bit more detail, but this is where you can go to find that information. And finally, for the standards of documentation, now with the new Tcfr, budget estimates are allowable, but it's only for an interim accounting period in this situation. At some point, you will need to go back and reconcile to ensure that the estimates that you provided when you charge are actually accurate and allowable at that point. But it does give you some more flexibility than the old circulars had. Now here's the example of a timesheet. And I sent out a sample timesheet that hopefully you can pick up and look at. I know that in the PowerPoint, it's so small that you can't see it. So I'm going to click, and hopefully everybody can see the Excel PowerPoint now. If you can, then we can talk about this process. This is a specific PowerPoint or a timesheet from Excel that a program would be using. Now in this situation, since you can see down at the very bottom, there's 2 tabs, one by activities and one by funding source. This one's actually by activities. Evidently the program that was using this at one time was required to have their timesheets filled out by the activities. The funder wanted more information. I don't know if any of the funders have remained with this. It might be just a situation where if you're not in good standing, they may want to ask you for a little bit more information. Here you can see that as we go down, you have the different types of funders that are in here. So you can look on line 10 and you can see that this is a CJD grant, a VOCA grant. And under it, you'll see the different types of activities that are allowable for the grant. And if you look on, let's say, the first of the month, there's actually some samples of an hour here for direct client services, 1.5 hours for the supervision. And then you can see at the bottom that 2.5 hours were for that day specific to that grant by that activity. Further down, you can see that they've got another CJD grant in the VAWA grant area for law enforcement, and that person had provided 4 hours for program support and administrative. So it goes down the process. They had a third grant for TAASA, and they had, that employee had 1.5 hours of supervision in that process. And as you can go further down, depending on the number of grants that you have and are required to do the activities, then you would put down each grant and the activities are in here. And then finally, you can see at the total at the bottom of the whole process, you'll see that there's other hours or activities that could be non-restrictive, which would be like foundation grants, or just that you have a foundation that provides unrestricted dollars. And then you'll have your total of the hours for that day. And you can see that on line 98, that employee actually spent 8 hours providing the services in that situation. They also have on line 99 a certification that just a standard certification that what they have provided is true and correct. In this situation, you can see that with the organization, there's 3 signatures. You truly only need 2, which would be the staff member or the employee certifying, and they should also put the date that they make the certification, and the supervisor. For this specific reason, there might have been a reason for the CEO to actually sign off on. It could be because of issues that happened before, or that the organization wants to have a little bit more control in that situation. So it's fine to go ahead and have 3, but you're only really required in that situation to have 2. And the requirement is really more that it meets best practices to have your time and effort reports signed and dated at that point. We'll go back up. The other tab, which I think I forgot to do in Spanish, is by funding source. In this situation, you have a funding source that's set in with the timesheet. On top, on line 8, you'll see a time in, time out, time in, time out. This organization wanted to have a little bit more control of the employee by registering the time in, time out. Those columns right there are not required by the circular. It's more a requirement by the entity themselves. So if you decide not to put that information in, you're not out of compliance. Some organizations think, well, this much information might be more micromanaging or too much information to put on. I just want to let people know that that's not a requirement. It could be a requirement by the entity itself, so that's something you would need to talk to your organization if you want to have that additional information. The main parts that are required will be now from F on would be there's HHSC family violence. That in this timesheet, you can see that this employee, which is an advocate, is split funded between HHSC family violence and the VOCA child sex trafficking grant. So in this case, you can see where their time allocation is working. They wouldn't put anything in for the VOCA family violence or the VOCA sexual assault because this employee was not funded by that part. So you could see that it's blank. As you go across, you can see total hours worked. That is actually the total hours worked on that particular day. You do have another part that would be total hours, and the total hours as you go out would be PTO, holiday leave, other leave. Some organizations just leave it as PTO and other leave, and then you document on your activities provided what that would be. PTO, personal time off, some organizations use just PTO and combine both their annual leave and sick leave into PTO. The reason I know that some organizations will use specifically annual leave and sick leave. When I was working for the Attorney General's, I worked for the state of Texas, they required that because if you left the state agency, you get paid for your annual leave that's accrued, but you don't get paid for your sick leave that's accrued. So that's why they had that set up. Now, if you retire from the organization, they will actually use both the annual leave and sick leave as part of your calculation for your retirement. So it works that direction. But if you don't have that requirement, I kind of recommend just having PTO and not worrying about whether it's annual leave or sick leave. You're just giving them personal time off. On the other leave, which could be holiday or other, you can have holiday. I kind of like it where it's just other, where you can just document there what type of leave that you're taking. So if you took 4 hours on the first day, it could be other leave as in holiday. It could be civic duty as in jury duty. You would just describe that. So that provides your fringe benefit part. And this is why in this type of report, it actually encompasses both your what you're being charged for and your fringe benefit. Fringe benefit in this situation, the way why it's done in this direction is because fringe benefit is an accrual of what you have performed the month before or months before. So you've actually in your PTO, you've actually accrued whatever the amount per month that your organization has. If it's a standard 8 hours, then you would accrue 8 hours of PTO. And then this shows when you're actually using the PTO in this process. As you go down further, all the way down to line 40, you'll see that there's 84 hours of the HHSC family family violence and 83 hours for the child sex trafficking. Underneath that percent of hours, you can show that it's very close. In this situation, you're very close. So you would use your 50% charge on each grant because there's not much difference. If you look further on 40, line 40 all the way to N, you'll see that there's 176 hours. That's kind of the total, that's the targeted hours that you would have shown, which excludes naturally weekends and in that kind of situation. The difference between the 176 and the 167 would be on line 42, which is just the difference of 9 hours. And you can tell that that difference is the accrual of your fringe benefits. So it allows you to reconcile everything at one time. As you can see with this timesheet, there's the employee's signature, supervisor's signature, and date. That meets all of the regulations that you need for your time and effort report. let me go back now to so now we've talked about your citations and everything and in compliance with the time and effort reporting. What the auditor will do once they've got both of the documents or several of the documents, they'll go through again and look at things. So in the payroll where they look at the process, they'll look to see if the salary and benefits are reasonable and necessary. Well, one way you would look at that is that if the funding agency awarded you that dollar amount, then it would naturally assume that it's reasonable and necessary. So you have yes in both situations. And so it matches with your FSR. They would actually look at that part to see if it's in your budget and potentially in your FSR when you do the actual charge for that month. Then they'll look to see that the time is in the current contract period. One situation with that is either at the beginning of your year or the end of your year, you may have time in the, divided in the situation that if you're doing a weekly report, you may have 3 or 4 days ending 1 month's period and then 2 to 3 days starting to the new contract period. They would look for those kind of things. Also on the back end, they would also look to see on your time and effort report if that's happening too, because what you should be billing would be just specifically to that current period, which is your contract or grant period. So they'll look at that. That might be an area where vulnerability for findings can be, because those are the two parts of the year that is different for your period of availability. They'll also go back and they're looking now at if the payroll is properly supported. So did the GL match with your FSR? Did your subsidiary reports match? And then also the time and effort that would all be inclusive and be the integrated part for the properly supporting of the time and effort. And in this case, you can see the example was that the program manager, again, the supervisor didn't sign that. So it was okay except for that one part, and they would be using that to provide for the finding that they're going to write up in their audit report. Again, overtime not paid, that is a situation that if your funding agency does not allow for overtime, then you would have to charge it to unrestricted. So they would be looking to see that the overtime was paid by unrestricted dollars. And in this case, example, yes and yes, that it was paid by unrestricted dollars, not by the grant. And then the other thing that they will look for is that your time and your charge is not billed to another grant. In other words, they're wanting to make sure you're not double dipping in your grant and charging off in that direction, and then also charging the same time and effort to another grant. Finally, since they're working on personnel to see about the charges and your compliance for your timesheets and all the supporting documentation, they'll probably spend the same time with the same positions that are awarded, and they will look at their personnel files. Now with personnel files, there is one area that you can work with, and that is that personnel files are within the records retention policy. So for federal grants, most federal grants will have it as a 3-year records retention. So after the last day of your grant period, when closeout is set, if it's 90 days for a closeout, then on the 91st day, that's when the time clicks for your records retention. After that time, after 3 years, you can go ahead and discard the information. One of the situations is if you have an Office of the Attorney General's grant, which is state funded, plus what they do with their grant, their records retention schedule is tied to the state library, which is the area that has the record retention policy for the state of Texas. In that situation, they actually have a 7-year records retention policy because they consider the grants as a contract. And in that situation, if you have that type of grant, then you would need to keep all this information for 7 years after closeout in order to be able to be in compliance before you can go ahead and take care of the documents that don't need to be there. So your personnel file could actually be one big file. Let's say a person's been there for 20 years. You might want to keep some of the things like your application and other things that were way back then, but other things like evaluations and other parts that are by a grant period, you can actually take out at the time when it's reasonably necessary under the records retention. So naturally, an auditor will look at the first thing is the job description. Does the job description match what the award has, so that if you're awarding for an employee to do specific stuff, does that job description meet the activities of the grant? That's one of the things they'll look for. In this case, you can see that it's yes and yes. Because of the grants that we have, when you're talking about victims, you want to make sure that the employee has a signed confidentiality agreement. This is very important with the information that is handled at that time. So you want to document that the employee understands and signs off on the confidentiality agreement. Another part is the acknowledgement of the personnel policies. All programs should have some sort of personnel policies. They could be combined in one policy, or it could be split between personnel policies and financial policies in that situation. In this example, again, it's that the program manager didn't sign the acknowledgement of personnel policy, so that would be a finding in that situation. Now we get to the I-9 and the E-Verify. For an employee that comes on board, each employee will need to do the I-9, and then it needs to be E-Verified. This is your employment process and should be kept throughout the time, even though it may be past the records retention. It's always good to keep some of those records that would be going ongoing, just in case an auditor wants to look at that information, see how did you onboard the person into the organization. Did they have this information so that they're legally allowed to be a employee of the organization? Now, staff evaluations, it's not written into the citations, federal citations, but an auditor will look at that because they're going to be looking at your policies and procedures. One of the values of having a staff evaluation is actually you're letting your employee know where they stand, how they can improve, or how they're doing well in that situation. A good reason for the staff evaluation, if you plan to give them a raise, that would be a good supporting documentation on why you decided to give that person a raise, let's say a 2% raise or something like that. In grants, you can provide raises. Most grants, a lot of times, because the dollars are static, a lot of times you can use that staff evaluation to give a one-time merit raise. That situation might be a part where you have unexpended dollars and you want to provide a merit to a person that you believe should get that merit. Then your staff evaluation would be your supporting documentation to give them, let's say, a $500 merit or a $1,000 merit. It depends on your organization, how you do that. Also, the last couple of things for your personnel files would be the acknowledgement of training that's been received. that would be part of the thing where as they go out and get training or conferences or anything else like that, that information should also be included in their personnel file. So in that situation, it might be an email, anything else that works with it as a good supporting documentation. Another good supporting documentation is actually the agenda from the training that they were taking in that situation. So you can, there's more flexibility in that process. And then the personnel records are maintained within the grant period. So the auditor would be looking at your personnel files, and they want to make sure that whatever you have for that grant period that fits within that process. Even though you may have some more information that you keep that's beyond their records retention policy, they want to have at least the minimum standards that within that grant period. So let's say your grant for 2020, those types of records are still maintained. Now we can open up to questions. If we didn't have any questions at the beginning, we can ask the questions at this point, and we can talk about that. One of the other things that we can also talk about is after the questions, then we can have an open-ended discussion on the electronic timekeeping system that people have to kind of discuss that just in case programs that are using timesheets want to move into that area of timesheets by electronic. TAASA just changed about a year ago, and we are now on Time Clock Plus, which is a software that works well for us. The good value of the software in that kind of situation is the software will actually have areas where you click on to either accept that you've accepted everything as an approval from the employee on what the time is actually allocated and the information that is provided is correct. The good part I like about that is that in the electronic system, it actually gives you the date and time that that part was accepted. The other part of that would be for ours is that the supervisor at the end of the week or in the month will go in and approve the time. And again, by clicking that button, it will provide that they have its documents that they've also reviewed and approved and that specific time. Now, in our system that we have for Time Clock Plus, we have an area where it shows the time as we log in and log out and provide that kind of information. And then the second part is more of a notes section, which is what you would see in your Excel notes section for description. And we just put a general description of what we've done for that day or that time frame at that point. Where we do keep most of our information about activities that we have performed throughout the month. We actually have another software that's called Salesforce, where we will go in and we'll provide a little bit more detailed information. And those two things are the adequate part for time and effort reporting. So now it's opened up. If you want to type in the question so that we can keep it in order to do an FAQ document. And then if you want to then later go ahead and unmute and discuss it, we can do that. So we'll start with that process first. Any questions?
Okay, Mark, this is Finian.
Yes.
I have Lee Menard has a question. She wants to know, says, do budget estimate percentages combined with record of actual hours worked account for appropriate supporting documentation?
On the timesheet, most of that would be something that you can do as a, for kind of a description, could be very basic in one sense. And then the supplemental part would be on a report. Now, I have seen timesheets that will have the timesheet itself, and down at the bottom in the second page of a spreadsheet will actually have the activities. So it's almost combining the two samples that were there, and it would then have more information about the activities that were done. That's one way to do that. The other way, like we have, is a database that provides that information. But what the auditor will actually look at is be reasonable and necessary. And really, reasonable would be if they look at the time and effort and the description, and it gives something that's reasonable about what you did at that time, that's probably going to be adequate enough. But, you know, at the same time, they could go ahead and ask a question about, can I look at your report, your other report at the same point? They may ask just to ensure that there's some other place that has more detail, and that's about as far as most auditors will go. Somebody raised their hand, I'm sorry.
Another question is, how do you account for time for contractors? This is from Brenda Rich.
Yes, contractors are in a different process. You can do that. It depends on what your contract is set. In one sense, your contract might be by units, could be hours, could be, let's say for counselors, it might be the number of counseling sessions, other things like that. That would be the process that you would need to kind of incorporate. So you may not need a timesheet in most cases for that unless you're, the contract itself, the deliverable is the number of hours. I've seen that before, let's say for attorney's fees and everything else, they naturally would do that. Or it might be for a CPA firm, they might do it by hours, charge them by that rate. But other contracts would be depending on the deliverable. So it's really the deliverable that will make the difference on how you record that. Now with the new guidance that they have, which is not in this area, they require a little bit more than they did before on contract management. And contract management in that situation is your subcontract. Who do you contract with? How do you provide a good assurance and everything else? And I have some forms that have helped some organizations when they've had a situation where the auditor doesn't think it's relevant or enough information. And you can contact me for that type of document.
Okay. Kathy Phelps wants to know if you can provide example of policies.
Yes, I'd have to go back and look at some of my policies I've had. I think I'll probably need to update one or two policies that would be a good example, because now that it's leaning towards more of the policies and procedures as internal control, I would think that most programs are still not quite adequate. So one of the things that I would put into a policy and procedures is first describing what the work hour is, or in the situation of the work week. If your organization has a 40-hour work week, that would be the policy, or the 36 hours, so you can set with that. Another thing that you would put into the policy is that overtime will only be provided by advance notification and advance approval. You would put those kind of things in there that would document. And I'd probably document a little bit of what was in the citations themselves in that situation, but I can work on that and hopefully send something out within 2 weeks.
Okay. Sue Grau, her question was, our independent auditor is not finished with our fiscal year 19 audit, is there an extension for submitting our single audit with grantors? The OMB has offered flexibility and hope grantors honor the same extension.
Well, there's a couple of things that have happened with COVID. During COVID, OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, has sent out a letter to, or a memo, it's really a memo, to all of the federal agencies. And part of the COVID, part of the memo was for COVID in that situation. And they're given more allowances for audits because they know that during COVID, it's hard for an organization to go out, a CPA firm, and do audits. I can provide that kind of information also. So they're given a lot of latitude in that situation. So extensions would be pretty easy to get.
Okay. This is from Melanie Carroll. Her question is, where are you tracking ineligible activities?
For ineligible activities, if you're tracking that, that would be in your unrestricted. So you would have a column that would be unrestricted or other. And that might be the fact that, let's say an employee works 80% of the time on a grant and then gets funded by the organization themselves for the other 20%. You would either designate it as other, or you just might even designate it as the organization as a funding source. So if they're doing unallowable activities, you would need to record it in that other, which would not be charged to the grant.
Okay, this is from Stephen Hood. His question is, we use time served by volunteers as a match for many of our grants. Are we required to maintain the same level of detail for the time served by volunteers that we do
Yes, for match,
paid staff?
yeah, for match, it should be very close to that. It may not be as detailed. You may have, instead of the funding sources out there, you would have the time reported, and then maybe in the description, let's say you're doing crisis hotline, or you're doing something like that, that would provide the information that you would need on there. And then you would be using those hours, which shows the activities, as the number of hours that are used for match. And then your match would be then in your GL or some other place where you are taking that hours times the what is the normal hours for volunteers. And I think there's some state rates that you can apply to that.
Okay. A question from Sharon Cook.
Oh, let me finish on that one
Oh,
thing
sorry.
too. Sometimes it's almost easier to go ahead and use the same timesheet, except just adapt it to a smaller version of it. And that would be fine in that direction. And then so that I think if you're very risk averse like I am, or I tend to be very close to the guidelines so that I can mitigate the audit risk, then you can do something like that. And I'm available if somebody wants to send me their volunteer timesheet, and I can help with that kind of analysis. Go ahead, Vivian.
Okay. This is from Sharon Cook. We were told by HHSC this type of timesheet did not identify domestic violence versus sexual assault activity, and therefore it was a finding which required us to change the timesheet.
Okay. Well, in that case, evidently, HHSC has a little bit more stricter standards on timesheets that they want. And I would think that maybe what we're talking about there is that first example where it was by activities. If that's the case, you would probably need to do it that direction. I hate to put it this way, but most organizations, you're going to comply with your biggest funder because that's where the money is and that's where it could be taken away and impact you much more. So I would tend to recommend if that funder is requiring that type of recording of time and effort, then you would use that for all of your grants. It may be a little bit more, but one of the vulnerabilities is if you change from timesheets from one grant to another, that's a variable that can cause internal control to be weak. And that could be an audit finding in the other direction. So in that regard, use your biggest funder as the direction that you need to do for timesheets. I can give you an example for everybody that timesheets come in so many different areas. So do audit work papers at the same time. I kind of equate them the same way. When I used to go out to CPA firms and do peer reviews to ensure that their audits are correct, I could go to 10 different CPA firms and they can do a fixed asset schedule for depreciation, and there could be 10 different ways, but they all meet the same information. It's just how it's shown in that direction. And that's what timesheets are. As long as you stay within the guidelines from the citations, you can adapt your timesheet to whatever your organization needs at that point.
Okay, the next one is from Camilla Atkins. Her question is, what about non-grant time? Add a column?
Yes. So if you have your grant and you have other things that are not grant related, that would be the other, or you might even call it unrestricted. So it shows that you're not charging those hours to the grant.
Okay.
A caveat to that, I'm sorry, caveat to that is if you have a person 100% funded by a grant, then they shouldn't have any hours that are dedicated to unrestricted. You'd more than likely would want to change that to, you know, some other kind of percentage if they still are going to do unallowable activities, because the worst thing to do is to charge 100%, but you're not doing 100%, then you'll have to pay back those dollars when the auditor hits a finding.
Okay. Cindy Smith, her question is, in a timesheet like this one, where is the employee keeping track of the PTO balance? You did answer that during the presentation, and she was okay with it. The next one is Melanie Carroll. Any acceptance of electronic signatures due to COVID?
Are those two different questions? I can answer the first one.
No, the first one, you already answered it during the presentation, but you can
Okay.
emphasize on it too if you want to.
Okay, what I kind of hear within the question is, how does an organization keep up with their, let's say PTO, their leave and accrual of that? It could be done on the spreadsheet itself. We used to do that with our spreadsheets when we were doing that with our time and effort reported at TAASA. It was converted to the database of Time Clock Plus has that information. If it's hard to do that because it changes from time to time, from month to month, you could actually do that as a separate report for each person and keep it that direction. And that way the employee knows how much time they have along with what the organization has. So it could be combined or it could be separate.
Okay. There's a question here. It came from an anonymous attendee. The question is, for an executive director, is it acceptable that no one signs below the director's signature as a supervisor when the executive director signs acknowledgement of personnel policies? The only other option would be to get a board member to sign, and that's time consuming.
Okay, so I know that in audits that I've seen before that is the biggest vulnerability of a ED or a CEO about the signature. The signature should come from the board, and it could be a specific person and it doesn't have to be the president of the board or anything, but it could be somebody that's assigned that has the ability to take the time and actually review it and sign it. It's part of the internal control process, and I've seen audits where findings are done like that. It's always kind of hard to have a subordinate sign because of the issue of internal control. Did that subordinate sign something that they might have been pressured to sign or anything else because that person supervises them? So internal control wise, it would be best to have somebody. Board wise, I'm sorry, I just want to add something to that. Board wise, it's always good to have some person assigned as, let's say, an ombudsman, which would be a person assigned that has more control, more contact with the staff in that situation, and they should be somebody that would be that the board would feel confident for any situation. Like say there's a grievance, the ombudsman would be the person. Instead of going straight to the board, they would go to somebody within the board that fulfills that position, and that person could probably be also the person that signs the ED or the CEO's time and effort report.
Okay. The next one is from the same anonymous attendee. So TAASA is using time clock plus basically to time in and out to show days/hours worked, and then using Salesforce to basically break down their daily hours by activity and or funding sources.
Is that a question or just a?
It's a question.
Okay. Well, we use it in that situation where as we go in to our daily, we'll log in to Time Clock Plus, log in when we're going to start the day. And it does have the ability, you could just put in one time in there that says from, let's say, 8 to 5 or whatever. Some can actually do it where it's going, okay, from let's say 7 to 11, and then another one will pop up that says from 11 to 12 lunch, and then another one would be for the rest of the day. So it depends on how it's set, you can set it up or how you want to add the information. The main thing is that with that, you want to make sure that you don't go over the 40 hours. So it provides that kind of part. With Time Clock Plus, it actually puts down a drop down that will say what grant you're on. So if you're on a multiple grant, from X time to X time, you would hit that type of button that would say either 100% to this or that you're shared by 2 different grants or more, or even more than that. And it does have a drop down for PTO and for holiday leave and everything else like that. So it's still the same basic part of a timesheet on Excel. It's just now system based.
Okay. This question is from Stephanie Bird. If an employee is 100% grant funded on one grant, do they still need to complete a full timesheet with hours and activities for each day, or will an employee effort certification that they worked 100% of their compensated hours on the grant project suffice? Is twice a year sufficient on the effort of certification?
Yes, there is some change from the Tcfr. There's a lot more latitude than before. Only the local units of government, if they had a person that was 100% on the fund, on the grant, they could do every 6 months a certification that they would sign off that their time was devoted 100% to that organization, to that funding source. They have now opened it up more, so there's more flexibility. A nonprofit can now do that where they couldn't before. And that's one way to account for time for 100% funded by a grant. That's the only time. If you're split funded, naturally, you're going to have to use a time and effort report. I would recommend that even though it doesn't really state how often now as it used to with the circular. In fact, that circular was for governmental units, which was A87 and was not allowed by anybody else for the other part. And it had that specific. I would recommend that if you do that as your timekeeping of 100% funded and you want to do this certification, I would do it a monthly certification. And the only reason for that is it doesn't truly provide that detail that it used to in A87. So to cover your bases, every month, if you're a 100% employee, you could do that instead of a spreadsheet.
I wanted to jump in for a second. I know in the Q&A, there were some questions that were answered by typing the answer, and they weren't necessarily read out loud. So we want to make sure that those questions are also accessible in Spanish.
Yes.
So I'm going to go ahead and say them in both English and Spanish on this channel. So one of the questions was, will the slides be available to us after the event?
I'm sorry, could you say that one more time? I didn't quite catch.
Will the slides be available to us after the event?
Yes, I did send slides out in the registration notification, but I can send slides out again. I did the slides in a PDF format so that people could take that at the beginning and write on it if they wanted to during this part, or they can just print it out later, or I can resend. If you haven't received one, just contact me by email. That's probably best than to stuff everybody's email with a blank shot.
Okay, and then another question, I believe you already answered. I just want to verify though. How do you account for contractors?
For contractors, you provide by the contract itself. So the contract would be how the deliverable is set. Some contracts might be by the hour, and if you do that, then they would need to provide the number of hours that they were working in that situation and the deliverable So let's say for professional service contracts that are for counselors, that might be a situation if they're not charging by the hour, but they're charging by the time that they're for the actual position, the time that the client comes in. It could be by just client base or how many counseling or how many group activities or other things like that, depending on how the contract is set. So it's different than timesheets for employees.
Okay, I think my guess is that this is specific, not specific, but a little more geared toward culturally specific grantees who will be using contractors more often. So that's helpful. There was also,
I can give an example for one thing. I know that we have some that an Asian organization that has a lot of interpreters, and they might have it for interpreting, let's say, flyers and other documents like that. They may do it by doing time that the interpreters actually were performing, or they could do it by the documents themselves. So it kind of, there's a lot of latitude in that situation. So it's kind of a part where you can actually negotiate in the contract period of what's your best process to pay.
so it would be in the invoices that you get from the contractor. Is that right?
Yes, it really, that's the guiding document. So let's say if it's a trainer on a contract and the number of trainings that they perform might be the guiding principle in that situation. So let's say every time a trainer goes out, they charge for whatever cost that both the organization and the trainer comes up with. Let's say it's $500 or $1,000 or other things like that. Then that would be the guiding principle. And then for payment, then you would actually, if it's by the training itself, you would actually, the contractor would send in something that reflects on the training. So either the agenda and other things that were done, and that shows the deliverable itself. That's how you could do it. If it was hours, then I would use an hourly basis.
Okay. And then I also wanted to clarify one other question. Brenda had also asked, is every organization audited? And Finian answered yes. I would like to add to that culturally specific grantees are going to be a little bit different. So under the SAS grants, we have culturally specific grantees, and that's going to be a little bit different in terms of an audit. And we can follow up, someone on our team can follow up with you and other culturally specific grantees if you're on the line. Please know we'll follow up with you about that separately. In general, organizations will be audited, just like Finian said, but culturally specific grantees, there's a small handful, and that will be a little bit different. So
Yes,
I just want to make that clear.
We're working with the governor's office on that specific kind of issue. So the deliverable that we have to do for contract or really subrecipient monitoring will be different than a lot of the other programs. That's something that will be guided by what is approved by the governor's office. And we're in discussions right now, specifically for the situation of COVID has brought up a lot of issues too. So we've been working on it for about 2 months now, trying to come up with the best.
Right, so
we'll be contacting them later.
So yeah, so for an organization like yours, Brenda, it'll be a little bit different. It's not going to be Just it'll be different. We'll follow up with you. And again, other culturally specific grantees that might be on the call as well. And give further guidance on what that will look like and how we'll go ahead and go forward with that. So I hope that information is helpful. And I think the rest of them, Finian already enunciated. The rest of the questions he already enunciated, and then those were already interpreted. I'm not sure if I missed anything.
Yeah, I still have some more questions.
Yeah. I just wanted to do it before I lost track of which one
Yes.
had been asked about.
Okay, Finian, go ahead.
Okay. Let me see where I stopped. Leah Buchanan asked, can we use ADP time card for time and attendance and also as supporting documents?
Without seeing the actual document, I would think so, as long as it meets those criteria under the documentation part. So if it shows that it's split funded and other things like that, the allocation, then you should be okay. I like having payroll done by a third party, but it's still, even with a third party, you need to have the all the issues that are in the guidance itself. So if it shows that it's got 100% of the time that the employee has, if it has multiple funding, that it's actually allocated to the right time for each funding source, those kind of specific things, then it should be okay.
Okay. Another question for Brenda Rich. Where and when do we submit the information that will be audited?
I'm sorry, you just got garbled up for a second. So can you say it again? I couldn't quite hear it.
Where and when do we submit the information that will be audited?
Let me see if I got the question. So do they submit the documents that they're going to be audited, or is the question is what documents do we need to send?
No, she wants to know where and when do they submit the information that will be audited?
There's a lot of feedback, Vivian, when you're speaking, so it's a little bit difficult to understand. So the question, I believe, is when and where is the information submitted for an audit? And I think that was part of Brenda's question about, is every organization going to be audited? But that might still be a valuable question for other folks in general. When and where is that information submitted for the audit?
Yeah, we can talk about it briefly here. We're going to have another webinar, which is on the audits itself and how to mitigate findings. But basically, you go by what the auditor asks the question. They may ask for information before they come, or if it's a desk review, they may ask you to send in the documents at a specific time. So it's really geared by the funding agency, because each funding agency does their monitoring a little bit different. And then the auditor themselves. So it might be something that typically most agencies and the auditors will send a letter out just notifying people that they're going to either have a desk review or an on-site. And then with that letter that goes out would be explaining what documents they need before field work or at the time of field work. So it's kind of, it depends on the organization. So you should be able to look at your engagement, what we call as an engagement letter. The auditor will send out a letter, engagement letter saying, we plan to audit you on X specific date. Please provide, and then they'll have the documents listed out before the audit or during the audit process.
Mark, Brenda wants to know if it's okay to schedule time to speak with you directly about their situation.
Yes. Anybody can schedule time with me by email, and then we can set up a time. I know that there's been some programs that have actually, they've told me that they don't want to bother me that with questions and everything else. The thing about it for both Finian and me, we're on the capacity grant and we have metrics to meet. So it's actually a win-win when you ask questions, because when you ask the question, we get to deliver the information, but we also get accounted on our grant. So don't worry about bothering me, because I really need that information just as much to provide that services just as much as the person needs that information.
I'd also like to jump in again
Yes.
and ask, for culturally specific grantees, we'll also be working with you and Mark to kind of fill out those situations that might be particular to your organization as a culturally specific grantee, just because those grants are going to work a little bit more differently. And we can definitely work with you, like maybe have a team call with Mark and Finian, and then with Virginia and I, or other folks that are kind of helping give you TA as a culturally specific word.
That's good. Thank you.
Okay, Mark, ready for another question?
Yes. You're still
Okay.
garbled, but
Due to COVID-19, is electronic signature acceptable?
the guidelines are, even without COVID, electronic signature is allowable. And I know some agencies that have actually, state agencies that have done their contracts that way, where they'll send it out and it'll be electronically signed and sent back in. The TAC rules, the Texas Administration Code, has that in there for the state of Texas that allows for electronic signatures. So it is allowable even without COVID. COVID just gives us a little bit more flexibility for all the kind of grants.
Okay, the next question is, this is from anonymous attendee. I understand we could charge 50% to a grant when the actual percentage of time worked was 49.73% or 50.9%. What is range of over or under is acceptable?
To me, there's if I understand the question, that in between the worked hours versus the time off, if it's different, there shouldn't be that big difference, because the hours that are worked that are time off, let's say PTO, holiday, or other, they're fringe benefits. They're treated as because those hours were already paid for, or accrued, let's put it that way, in the previous months. So it won't make a difference in the calculation of your hours in one sense, for the work in one sense. Because if you're multiply funded, let's say 2 grants, you don't need to go back and then allocate the amount of time off, because that was actually accrued in the month before. So what you're looking for is what was actually worked in that month. Now, variables should be okay in the situation, and that's by each agency. If it's a variable of just about a couple of percentages from one month to another, or a couple of hours from one month to another, that's real world. That shouldn't be a problem. What it becomes a problem is with, let's say you're 50% funded, but in that month you only attributed only 20% of those activities. then you would need to figure out and talk to your grant manager, but probably just charge for the 20%.
Okay. The last question I have here is, could you provide your best contact email address?
You're garbled again, so I'm so sorry.
The question is just about providing your best email, the best way to contact you.
My best way to contact me is on the slides themselves, but my email address is mhernandez@taasa.org. That's the best way to contact me first, and then we can figure out whether doing a phone call might be better, or just answering by emails, or we could actually even do a Zoom meeting at the same time. I've done Zoom meetings for board members in a situation. So there's a lot of different ways, but I think the best way first is by email, and then we can figure out what's the better alternative afterwards.
A question just came in, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yes, well,
Hold on. Okay, can you hear me?
kind of. Go ahead and ask the question. Maybe Denise might be able to hear it a little bit better than me.
Which question are you on Nia's question?
Yeah, Nia's question, yes.
Okay. I also just want to do a general reminder that it's a little bit after 3 already, and I want to be respectful of folks' time. So
Yes.
if you, so I just want to say that. Take care of you, do what you got to do. So the question from Nia is, with reporting, is it best to report monthly or by pay periods, being that pay periods can include previous month activity?
That would be, as long as you're within the period of availability between months, it will not be as big of a problem. The issue will be at the beginning of the year contract period or the end of the contract period, where now some of those dollars will be outside the contract period, so the hours may not be allowed at that point. So that's the vulnerability. But if your time and effort reporting and your payroll periods might be off by a little bit, I would go ahead and notify the grant manager, but there shouldn't be a problem in that situation, because more than likely, as long as it stays within the contract period, what you do in one month will be covered in the next month, and there might be a day or two difference, but it shouldn't be a problem. It's only at the beginning of the contract period and at the end where you'll have an issue.
Mark, just real quick, also, there was a question about, I know the webinar is being recorded. Will you be sending it out to everyone that registered?
Yes, I'll just need to work with Shelby on how do we send that out, because we're going to send it to the governor's office at the same time so that the child sex trafficking grantees will have that off of that website. We're hoping to have that on our own website so that it can go out to anybody at any time.
One more last question, Mark.
Okay.
Can you hear me very well?
Kind of.
Okay. It's from an anonymous attendee. If our company pays on a semi-monthly basis, do you foresee any issue with the pay information for salaried employees listing out 86.67 hours paid each pay period due to the capabilities of the payroll system, as long as the correct hours for the pay period are listed on the timesheet?
For that one, we'll look at that, but please email me so we can talk about that. There might be a little bit of a difference. One of the issues is that you may have salaried employees, but they may be non-exempt employees. And there'll be the issue of FSLA, whether it's overtime or not, in that kind of situation. So even if you're salaried, if you're non-exempt, there's an issue. And I'd rather talk about it individually. And any other questions you can send to us. And for the first week, we will be handling that. We'll answer all emails, but it'll probably be the first week that we want to have the questions so that we can have the FAQ document ready to go in the second week. We still, through that process, one of our processes is to answer them, but then we do what we call QC, quality control, to ensure that we've speak with one voice with the different funding agencies at the same time so that we don't put anybody at risk.
I also included in the chat box the email addresses as requested. So there's Mark Hernandez, Mark is the one going through the slides and answering the bulk of these questions. His email address is included in the chat box. For culturally specific grantees, your main contact usually is going to be Amanda Lewis, and I've included her email address there, or me, Denise Loya, at dloya@taasa.org, or Virginia, who is also on the call under regional support. So we all offer TA for culturally specific grantees. And I've also included Finian's email address. So all of those are in the chat box, should you need any assistance or further clarification.
Denise, did we make the copy of the links for the evaluation? I think, Finian, were you able to get that into the chat box so that people can click in there?
I was about to do that.
Maybe that can be done via follow-up email with folks and just let them
Yeah, I can do that for
there
that.
will be an evaluation, and we ask that you please fill that out to the best of your ability. It would be great to give us feedback.
Yeah. Where I'm really more would be to have question 4 answered, because that's where I get the information from everybody of what they would like to hear in that situation. So what other kind of topics are out there, whether it's budgeting, accounting, auditing, compliance, other things like that, that we can do. I will then take those and see if we already have one that we've recorded before, or that we'll be able to set one up at some point.
Evaluations will be available in English and Spanish.
Well, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. And thank you, Denise, and all of our interpreters for helping us out on this. This is the first time for me to go through this process, so y'all have helped me out tremendously to go to the next level.
Yeah. Yes, thank you to Howard and thank you to Tanya, our interpreters. Muchísimas gracias a Tanya y a Howard por estar interpretando para nosotros. And thank you, Virginia and Finian as well. Gracias también a Virginia y Finian.
Gracias, señora. Gracias, correcto. Mark.
We'll see y'all. Bye-bye.
I have a question.
Okay.
Maybe we could just wait for a few minutes to let folks log off.
Okay. Yeah, I stopped my share so that you can then figure out when to end.
Yeah, I would suggest we stay on for another few minutes.
Okay. And there I am.
also had some questions, and she, so I wanted to stay on the line for a minute for her. I think everyone else, if you could log off, or if you have any other questions, you can also email Mark. Email Mark, Finian, Amanda, myself, any of the folks that are listed on the chat. All right. So Finian, you had a question, but Andrea also wanted to speak. So if Mark, you wouldn't mind, as the host, if you could stop the interpretation.
Oh, okay. So just hit the
Or-
interpretation.
Or you could just transfer over the host duties to me. Do you know how to do that?
No, but you can show me how and I'll do that.
Okay, at the bottom of your screen where the interpretation sign is, globe,
Okay, the globe.
click on that,
Okay,
and then you see it should say manage interpretation.
okay, got it. And just click it.
Click on that, and then you end interpretation.
Gotcha. Okay, good.
Okay, so now everybody's in the main channel. ¿Nos puede oír, Ana Andrea?
So you don't want us to interpret?
If you could stay on the line, but since it'll just be a smaller group, it'll just, maybe we could just do it on the same channel together.
Okay, it'll be more awkward because you're going to have to wait each time. You know, I mean, we could have stayed in interpretation is all I'm saying.
I think it'll just be easier because we'll need the Spanish, and in addition, she's a culturally specific grantee, so it's a little bit convoluted. It's a little bit more.
Okay.
Si nos puede. Oh, she already.
And Andrea logged out, and we're still recording. I think you need to stop the recording.